Today, we are debating a motion to produce documents, have the Liberal government produce documents and send them to the RCMP of SDTC, a foundation set up 20 years ago by a Liberal government to invest in pre-commercialized green technology. And that organization was doing good work. In fact, in 2017, the Auditor General did a governance audit and found that they were complying with all of the best practices. Unfortunately, after that, the chair of the time at the board started to criticize the government publicly around the breaches of data, its weak privacy policies, appearing before parliamentary committees. And that Minister of the Day of Industry, Navdeep Bains, and his office phoned the president of the Green Slush Fund, as it's become known, and asked them if they could get this chair to stop criticizing the government publicly. Well, this chair wasn't taking orders from this government and continued to criticize the government. And after an appearance at a parliamentary committee, 2 days after that, the minister's office phoned and said, for some reason, we're going to change the chair. And here's two names. They told the president, we want you to check it out. Minister Navdeep Bains phoned the president personally and said, we're changing the chair. He's saying things we don't like. You haven't been able to keep him quiet. Here's two names. We want you to check them out. The president, Leah Lawrence, testified in industry committee that she checked them out. The first one declined because they had a conflict. The second one said, I'm willing to do it, even though I have a conflict. Now, she advised the assistant deputy minister, Mr. Noseworthy, who was the liaison who sat in the board meetings, that this was an inappropriate appointment of a chair because she was conflicted. And she was conflicted because the Green Slush Fund was already doing business with her company. But Ms. Fisherian had no problem with being in a conflicted position because she was doing the same thing at an organization called Mars in Toronto, which I said also helps the finance. So this board, the minister came back through the ADM a couple of weeks later and said, okay, we're changing him. You phone the current chair, Mr. Bolsilli, tell him he's out. 3 days later, Annette Fisherian's in over the stringent objections of the organization, including their head of communications, who only a few months earlier was working in the Prime Minister's office and phoned the minister's office to say that this was inappropriate. And this is all in testimony. So what happened? This was the fourth or fifth appointment that then Minister Bains had made. And it's quite a record of insider dealing and trading. This $1 billion slush fund, $1 billion, as the Auditor General found out in a small portion, 5 years that the Auditor General released this week, audited, that 186 transactions that the board members voted on to give companies money were companies that board members had an ownership interest in. 186 times. The Auditor General pointed out that in 90 of those times they didn't even declare the conflict of interest, and that money alone totaled $76 million. This led whistleblowers to go to the government a year and a half ago to seek help and to stop this corruption. The CFO from the industry department is quoted as saying, this is the biggest scandal since the sponsorship scandal. Well, actually, but that was a Liberal scandal as well in a previous government. And this scandal is huge in terms of dollars compared to that one. Almost half of all the transactions in the period of time that the Auditor General audited were transactions that this board voted money to companies that they owned. Almost half of this $1 billion slush fund to them, feathering their own interest. Public office holders have to comply with the Conflict of Interest Act. The Conflict of Interest Act says when you're a public office holder, you cannot financially benefit from any job you're appointed to by the government. The SDTC Act, an act of Parliament, says that individual board members cannot participate and benefit for them or their families in any decision that financially makes their situation better. Yet these directors did it 186 times. Well, the senior departmental official sat in the meeting. That departmental official briefed his deputy minister at the time, who I'm sure briefed the minister. Minister Baines did nothing, 46 months. The current minister, 46 months this was going on. He did absolutely nothing until the whistleblowers came public. To give you some idea of the graft and corruption, Andre Lise-Matteau, a director appointed in 2016 by Minister Baines, while she was on the board, her companies that she has an equity investment in received $42.5 million from the Green Slush Fund. Before she was appointed to the board, her companies received $143 million from the Green Slush Fund. She should never have been appointed to the board. She had an immediate conflict of interest. It was in breach of both the Conflict of Interest Act and the SDTC Act to appoint her. The Annette Vacharian, who was the chair, we went through that. She has a company called NR Store, which was receiving government money. She was appointed to the board and should not have been. Guy Ouimet admitted in committee that he sat in committee and voted $4 million to his own company that he owns equity in, and nobody in the government stopped it. A direct conflict of interest. Stephen Kukucher, the organizer for the current Liberal leader in British Columbia and a former Liberal staffer to an environment minister, his companies, while he was on the board, received almost $25 million. This is massive corruption of a scale and fraud not seen in Canada in my recent memory, which is longer, I think, than some of the people here. At least I'm told that frequently. So what we have is a situation where last night we actually summoned, it was the only way we could get him, former Minister Navdeep Baines, to the Industry Committee. He now works for the largest and most expensive cell phone company in Canada, Rogers, or the most expensive in the world. He was the minister who was supposed to reduce cell phone prices, but actually ended up selling out and joining the most expensive company in the world now in the last 2 years. So this individual, I think he was actually zooming in, but it looked more to me like he was some sort of avatar that was programmed with only 2 answers. It's a public and open process, and I had nothing to do with it. Obviously, if the minister had nothing to do with it, then that minister was directed by the PMO to appoint these Liberal hacks and cronies and swindlers to this board. So he betrayed and said, I don't have anything to do with it. His chief of staff said, oh, I didn't have anything to do with it. They played the Hogan's Heroes Sergeant Schultz card and said, I know nothing. Talk to somebody else. Typical of this government and everybody in this government. It's never the fault of the person who made the appointment. It's somebody else's fault. The dog ate my homework government. So what we're asking for here is that this House pass a motion saying that this corruption has to end. Not only does it have to end, it has to be investigated by the RCMP now that we have the Auditor General's report. So I would ask and encourage all members to please show the ethics necessary for us and for Canadian taxpayers and ensure that any legal activity is dealt with by the police.
Hear, hear.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. To the point, the government has consistently acknowledged the work that our independent officers do for the House of Commons on behalf of Canadians. And where there's a need, the government has taken to action to address the concerns, and we continue to wait, and we will ultimately see what takes place. Having said that, I would contrast some of the actions of this government in comparison to previous administrations. You had the ETS scandal, which was in excess of $400 million under the Harper regime, where they completely ignored the issue, denying any sorts of accountability and transparency. And the member can feel free to provide comment on that if he likes.
The Honourable Member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
Well, I understand why the Parliamentary Secretary, the Parliamentary Secretary doesn't want to talk about this scandal, which we're debating today. The issue is this government claims to have done something, but actually it's the whistleblowers that exposed this corruption because the government wasn't doing its job. They exposed it, and even after receiving it, the government did nothing except call in a study. And it wasn't until the Ethics Committee, led by a 1064 motion by our ethics critic, called in and asked for this to be investigated by the Auditor General. The Auditor General's review got done because of the actions of our side, the official opposition, not by these Liberals who continue to cover up corruption.
Questions and comments. L'honorable député de...
The Honourable Member for Mirabel. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Former Minister Baines was at the Industry Committee yesterday, and in the Auditor General's report, it's clearly stated that the Minister of the time had the power to ask audits at the SDTC to see what was happening. And I asked the Minister how many audits he had requested. Not only did the former Minister not answer, but we also know that the number was absolutely zero. He said that this fund was fully independent. So my question, what should Minister Baines have done at the time while there were allegations already being made?
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Member for South Shore, St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. That was an excellent question that the member from Mirabel asked in the committee meeting last night. And of course, the automaton AI-generated vision of former Minister Baines just stuck with the process, and the answer obviously was zero because he wouldn't answer it. What the Minister Baines could have done in the first place to prevent this is not appoint corrupt Liberals to the board, appoint people with ethical approaches to business, and ensure that when he got the monthly reports from the board of the board meetings of what was going on, the minister actually did something to stop the corruption of the 186 times they voted themselves money.
Questions and comments. The Honourable for Windsor West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. One of the good examples of somehow that's going to escape the current process that the government has decided is an interesting point that the member has actually talked about before, is Annette Verschuren is a good example, receiving all kinds of money from several different projects, but even this SDTC, what about the managers that got bonuses to give money to projects that weren't even recommended to actually be accepted? Why aren't we actually getting the money back from those people? Because they got those bonuses on the backs of corruption and malfeasance at the expense of the workers who I've been trying to raise as a real victim in all of this situation.
Good question.
The Honourable for South Shore St. Margaret's has 1 minute to respond.
It's absolutely true. Like a lot of things with this government, the management of SDTC wasn't paid for results, they were paid for output, which generated the need to say, okay, you get a bonus just because you put out money in a project. Not a great way to go forward on this. I would say again that the governance structure of this organization, which deteriorated greatly in 2019, when the chair changed the rules on the conflict of interest to suit her own benefit and actually allowed directors to buy shares 3 days after the board approved money into a company, it allowed the directors to actually go and buy shares in insider trading in those companies. That's how bad the corruption of this organization was under these Liberals.